But I was curious about this new weapons nonetheless, because you mentioned the British. I think they've been very much in the lead of these escalations. I mean, they're the ones who were pushing heavy for tanks. They sent the ammunition with depleted uranium. And of course, these new long distance weapons. Do you see any of this as being a big game changer, something that can give the Ukrainians significant advance? A significant advantage. We keep talking about, turning the tide and, which is kind of a contradiction in terms, because we keep saying that Ukrainians are winning, they're winning, yet we have to turn the tide. So there's, some faults in the narrative, obviously. But do you see any of these weapons being something that can make a decisive difference?
Well, you recall the enormous detonations and explosions we witnessed near Khmelnytsky in western Ukraine, where you had large numbers of these Storm Shadow missiles and DU rounds stored for eventual disposition and use on the front. Again, as I pointed out earlier, the Russians know where these caches are. They know where the supplies are, and they have been systematically destroying them. So even though you may get 20, 30, 40 Storm Shadow missiles, how many of those are ever going to reach the front? Now, I don't know what the number is that has actually gotten there. I do know that they fired some, and I do know that a small number, 1, 2, or 3, have actually made it through integrated air defenses on the Russian side and hit some targets down south. Is that going to make a difference? 3 missiles? In other words, if you had 1,000 missiles at your disposal with which you could attack in support of your ground forces, which were thoroughly organized, trained, and equipped with predictable sets of equipment after predictable, periods of long-term training, then I would say you had a shot at doing some real damage and making a difference. That doesn't exist. Those conditions don't exist. So the big answer to your question is no. If you can pinpoint a target in Kramatorsk or a target outside of Dnipro, or a target anywhere else in Ukraine that you think harbors equipment, weapons, troops with impunity, and that's what the Russians could do right now, how far can you really expect the Ukrainians to get? I don't think very far.
And I also wanted to ask you about how you see NATO being impacted by this war, because there's a lot of official statements, obviously, both by the officials, but also in the media. The main argument that NATO's getting stronger, they're more unified than ever, and obviously the concerns of Russia certainly becomes a source of solidarity. But on the other hand, I also hear people like Lawrence Wilkerson, who was a retired U.S. colonel and also chief of staff for Colin Powell, who argues that the Europeans are becoming more apprehensive about the U.S. Not contributing to provoke this war, but also not wanting to make any negotiations and continuing with the British, of course, to escalate. But more importantly, Wilkerson pointed out that what he saw was that the Europeans were becoming the major economic victim in this war, and besides from Ukraine, obviously, who suffer more humanitarian level, but for this reason, as the Europeans now are weakened and becomes excessively dependent on the US, he argues that there's a lot of resentment coming up from the surface. Then obviously Macron being the key example of this new pushback. But so he actually questions whether or not NATO will be able to survive if this war drags on. Do you see it in a similar way, or how do you see NATO coming out of this war?
On or about 9 or 10 January, I was invited to participate in a discussion on this topic. There were several questions. The one was, and this was at the Center for the National Interest, which has since gone out of existence. Dimitri Simes was the moderator for the discussion. And at the time they said, well, will the Russians go in? I said, absolutely. Everybody else said, well, it's unclear. We'll have to see. No, I don't think so. They'll never risk it, blah, blah, blah. Then the next question was, well, what's the impact on NATO? And I said then that I did not think the North Atlantic Treaty Organization would survive the war. It's very simple. You have 30 plus nations most of them have interests that other nations within the alliance don't share. If you stand in Rome or Athens or Sofia, you have a different strategic picture from the people that live in Berlin, Oslo, or Amsterdam. You don't see the world the same way. You don't see the same world if you're in Paris. In other words, where you sit has a big impact on your view of things. Secondly, if we had brought this war to a rapid close, say we'd interrupted the operations at the end of February and beginning of March and say, wait a minute, that's enough. We have to arrange peace talks. Let's have a ceasefire. We'll host it. And Ukrainians and Russians will work this out, and we will be supportive of whatever, the two sides can reach in terms of an agreement. We didn't do that. And so now the opportunity for that kind of thing is really very, very weak. So I think that inside Europe, once you get past the facade, you go behind the facade of unity, there's extreme concern about what will happen. You have the Norwegians, for instance, who are very interested in having the United States help protect their interests in the North Atlantic and protect their border with Russia up on the Arctic Circle. What do you do if at the end of this whole thing, if the continental Europeans say, well, we've had enough? The only thing the Americans have done is drag us into a destructive war that we didn't need to fight against a country that really wasn't our enemy, contrary to the popular belief and the standard narrative and propaganda. That's when you're going to see things break down. And I think that's coming. I think it's already being discussed behind the scenes, but it's going to break out into the open. You've already had comments slipping out from the French, from Macron and others to suggest this. And again, if you're in Southern Europe, you see the world as one way. If you're in Western, another. If you're in Central East, another. It's very hard to hold a large alliance like that together in peacetime, let alone in war. So I don't have any faith at all that this thing called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization will survive this entire crisis. I'd be very surprised if it did.
How about the ability to, well, you mentioned that we should have tried to find a peace or end this war once it broke out in February of last year. But, well, given that we're here now in June of 2023 and, the war is still raging on and we appear to be losing, is there any possibility of reaching a peace? I mean, from both sides, both from NATO and Ukraine, but also Russia on the other sides, because from the Russian perspective, they've, well, from what I hear talking to Russians, their main thought would be, well, why would they trust us again? Because, look at the Minsk agreement. The main assumption would be we would merely, agree to a ceasefire and use this time to rearm Ukraine and then fight another day. Much like the Minsk agreement. But, also you hear similar arguments on NATO side that we can't have a ceasefire with Russia, because this will allow Russia to rearm, regroup, and then fight another day. So we appear to have the same argument. The commonality, I guess, is zero trust in the opponent. So given that this is the case, even if we want peace, is there any possibility at all to sit down and agree to anything?
Well, keep in mind that, as I pointed out earlier, the Russian military in January, February 2022 was much smaller, not nearly as well armed, and their goals and objectives at the beginning of this thing were actually quite modest. We changed that by trying to drag them deeper and deeper into conflict, thinking that if we could pull them into conflict, they would wear out, they would fail, they would collapse. And we continue to hear this nonsense all the time. Oh, Russian morale is terrible. Russian troops aren't any good. Generals are incompetent. Equipment's no good on them. It's all nonsense. It's exactly the opposite. All of those things can be said about the Ukrainians. So right now, the real question is, if you're in the driver's seat, why would you want an end to the war if you're sitting in Moscow? Well, because the Russians really didn't want a war to begin with. What they'd like to have is a good business environment. But we've destroyed that for them in the West. We've tried to use our financial system to destroy them. We've tried to harm them in any way we could with our sanctions. None of it's worked. And so you have something else happening right now in St. Petersburg in June. And that, I don't know if that's going to coincide with the Vilnius meeting for NATO, but I think they're going to be pretty close. And in St. Petersburg, you're going to have over 84 nations talking about how they can go to a new gold-backed currency system and begin trading with each other internally on the basis of a gold standard. And of course, the Chinese, the Russians, the Indians, the Saudis, and others have amassed enormous quantities of gold, so they can do business that way. We're not in the same position. In the meantime, we increasingly don't have the kind of support from the rest of the world that the Russians and the Chinese do. We made ourselves pretty unpopular over the years. So how do we get an end to this thing? We have to say something we don't want to say. Let's talk without preconditions. Number one, no preconditions. And hear what the Russians say. Remember, the Russians sent us several proposals. We wouldn't even consider them. This is back in December and January of 2022. We just dismissed them out of hand. So we haven't listened. Are we prepared to listen now? And as you're pointing out, you don't think so. But I think the Europeans, if they change the heads of government, at least in key states, and they change the nature of the people that they send to negotiate, I think there's a chance for something good to happen. But if you pick someone like this woman, Baerbock, this foreign minister who behaves like an American teenager in high school, trying to demonstrate for some silly cause in 1969, you're not going to get anywhere. I mean, if I were Lavrov, I wouldn't take her seriously. I wouldn't pay any attention to anything the woman said. So you got to get rid of these people and then send somebody who's serious. I mean, everybody took Helmut Schmidt seriously. Everybody took Kohl seriously. I mean, these men had stature. They had experience. They had credibility. Now, Gerhard Schröder was a bit of a disappointment, but he didn't change too much. But the real problem we had was with Merkel, who, as you point out, turns out to have been part of the big lie at Minsk. So she and anybody associated with her is going to, raise real questions in Russian minds. But I think the Russians would like to see this go away. By the way, cheap energy is absolutely vital to the success of any civilization. Civilizations are built on it. People talk about human slavery. Slavery was cheap energy. That's how great civilizations began. The point is, we've got to go back to it. Now, how do we get cheap energy? In the United States, we've destroyed the energy sector. And by that I mean that the big firms that build the refineries and extract the oil and the petroleum and everything else and the natural gas, they're not extracting beyond what they've already got because they see no incentive to do so. You have a similar problem right now in Europe. The Germans just shut down the last nuclear power plant. And somebody said, well, we have to do that for climate change. Well, I don't even want to waste time on that subject. But let's assume that your concerns about climate change are figuring prominently. Do you destroy everything that you have before you have a viable alternative? Do you really think you're going to live on windmills? It's sort of nonsense. There was no thinking, which is extremely un-German, by the way. I would have thought that the Germans would have said, look, we share these goals. However, we cannot reach X, Y, and Z given current circumstances, or we put our economy at risk, we put our standard of living at risk, we put people's jobs at risk. Well, all of that caution was thrown through the window. So, when do we get new governments? People that are rational and sober and recognize that things can be done, but not as rapidly as they'd hoped and not as radically as apparently they've supported. I think Putin is going to wait a certain amount of time, but then he's not going to wait forever. And if he has to move all the way to the Polish border, he'll do it. I don't think anybody should question that. And I don't see any evidence. Maybe you do, Glenn, but I don't see any evidence for anybody in Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Germany, France, mobilizing their countries for war. Do you?